Hello there, and welcome to a podcast segment that we like to call Ludic Lives. Now, Ludic Lives is a sub-podcast of our overall podcast, Ludic Lounge. Thank you for rating, subscribing on Apple, Spotify, or any other of the podcatchers of your choice. What Ludic Lives intends to be is just a free-form interview of people that we find interesting. Now, this isn't necessarily to say that they're going to be movie stars or famous athletes. These are just regular people who we find interesting. People who have a story to tell. Their story. In this life, a lot of times, we forget to stop, and we forget to listen, we forget to ask those around us, and especially people close to us, about their story, their narrative, how they see themselves and the world, and how they see themselves in the world. So thank you for taking the time to listen, thank you for rating, thank you for subscribing, and we hope you enjoy. Hello, you fine, gentle folk. Antonicus Maximus here with another edition of Ludic Lives, the sub-podcast here for the Ludic Lounge. And with me today, my friend, hopefully your friend too, soon, Randall. Randall, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. How's it going? Happy to be here.
Yay! I'm glad you're here as well. So full disclosure, ladies and gentlemen, and other fine, gentle folk listening at home, Rand is married to Robin, who you all know from earlier Ludic Lives episodes, and that's how we became friends. And without further ado, Rand, I'd like to ask you, what is it that you feel comfortable sharing about yourself with the listeners listening at home?
Yeah, so I'm currently living in Seattle, recently moved here last year from Philadelphia. And I work at the University of Washington. I've worked in higher ed for about 6 years. I do photography. I'm a gamer. I stream on Twitch, all that kind of stuff. Normally, I do a lot of hiking, get outside, get outdoors, do stuff, go see movies. Haven't been doing much of that since the pandemic started.
Oh, yeah,
that's how it usually goes.
A little thing called COVID out there, right? Isn't that
Yeah. And we were the start. We thought we were the start of the pandemic until we figured out that it was New York City. But
geez.
So it's been pretty rough here. I've basically been working from home since March, and seen very few people since then.
So one of the things you mentioned is that you're starting your stream, and go ahead and plug that, because everyone listening at home, if you are on Twitch, you like the platform, I've recently been watching Rand. I think he's going to be excellent. He's going to be in the top tier one day, in my personal humble opinion. So Rand, go ahead and plug that.
Oh, sure. So my handle on Twitch is Knish of Death, spelled KNISHOF Death, DEATH. And it's a variety stream. I play different types of games. I do political commentary. I have a pretty extensive background in sociology, did activism for a long time around like various social justice issues, animal rights, those kinds of environmentalism, those kinds of issues, from, starting early in high school in Southern California to Portland, Oregon, to Occupy in Hawaii. And then in Philly, I've been doing a lot of different things over the years. So I will be integrating some of that into my stream too, doing some political commentary, reacting to the news of the day. It really just depends. My hope for the stream is just building a good community of like wholesome people that want to discuss issues and play some fun games. And, sometimes you need an escape from everything too. So I'm hoping my stream can be that as well. It was really weird. I was streaming on Wednesday, when all that stuff was going down at the Capitol building. And in that moment, I just needed a break. This whole time, this whole last 4 years with Trump and everything that's been going on has been absolutely exhausting. I've been doing activism for nearly 20 years, and I feel mentally and emotionally exhausted by everything that's been happening. And sometimes you just need a break. So we played a really pretty game called Lost Embers, where you get to like explore this, fantasy open forest world as different animals. And I thought that provided like a nice opportunity to get away from everything and not think about the news 24/7, because it can be overwhelming and unhealthy.
Absolutely. But one of the things I appreciate about your streams, Rand, is that while, yes, it is a great escape and the games you play are beautiful and I'm enjoying them, but you also don't hide from the news. You know what I mean? Because there's a difference, in my personal opinion, between needing an escape and hiding.
Yeah. I'm not capable of doing that. As you know, Anthony, but your audience probably doesn't know, I lived in Hawaii for about 4.5 years. And I kind of thought when I moved there that I'd be able to like chill out a little bit and escape from everything and hide from it. And what I figured out very quickly was that I'm not capable of that. Like if I can't do it there, I can't do it anywhere. I probably got the most politically engaged I ever have been while living in Hawaii. So yeah, I don't avoid it. My plan is to really just, a good stream is based on the community that watches it. And I will engage with whatever the community, is hoping for, wherever that kind of leads. If that leads to political commentary, great. If that leads to escaping into a beautiful game or a fun game or a scary game and like seeing reactions and stuff like that, I'm happy to see that.
And I'm happy to join it. And folks, I invite you as well. But Rand, one of the things you mentioned is that you've been doing activism for 20 plus years. What is, in your mind, the most difficult aspect of it?
Not burning out. That's probably the hardest part. And not getting discouraged. We make steps towards progress, and then we take steps back, and you have to keep fighting, you have to keep working, and you have to also find balance in your life. I think that's the most important thing, right? It doesn't matter what you can do for 6 months. This is a long game. Achieving, any kind of social justice goals or goals around environmentalism or animal rights, and I consider those all to be social justice goals as well for various reasons, right? Because all of these problems are intersectional. You have to be able to do it for the long game. It's not going to be done in 6 months or a year or 5 years. The right in the United States has been planning their approach to politics since the Reagan era, and they've just inched it forward every time since. And that was, nearly 40 years ago now. So we have to be planning similarly if we want to see our goals enacted, if we want to be able to create the better world that we envision for ourselves.
Now, Rand, you mentioned a lot of these things are meet at a cusp of intersectionality. How do you explain that? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So it's the fact that like all of these social justice issues, whether we're talking about houselessness, we're talking about racism, systemic racism, issues around feminism and sexual consent and identity, whether that's racial identity, gender identity, whatever that kind of looks like, whether that's addressing issues around climate change. You can't separate all of these issues. They all intersect. So people most likely to be affected by climate change most directly are people of color and people who are poor. And that's on a global scale. That's both in the United States and outside of the United States. That's both like international and national, right? So for example, a lot of products that people buy in the United States are made in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a fairly underdeveloped, underinvested in country, with the exception of like foreign direct investment around manufacturing for places like the United States. And they also happen to be one of the most sensitive to climate change because of where that country sits and its impact, its sensitivity to flood water and storm surge and things like that. You can't separate issues of income inequality on a global scale, poverty on a global scale, economic development, and climate change. They all intersect, right? It's just like if someone's going to build some kind of industrial manufacturing plant that has pollution, most likely that's not going to be in a wealthy neighborhood. It's not going to be in your mom's country club's suburban neighborhood that surrounds a golf course. That's just not going to happen, right? They put things that pollute. They pollute areas that are poor and have less power and less ability to fight back, right? Because if you try to do that in a wealthy neighborhood, people are going to hire lawyers and go to your city council meetings and get the project squashed from the very get-go, right? Yeah. It's not going to be put in your neighborhood if you come from a place of privilege. It's going to be put in someone else's neighborhood that doesn't have that privilege and doesn't have that power. That's how power operates, both in the world, which is important, and in the United States more directly.
No, absolutely. And kind of along those lines, speaking of activism, things like that, you mentioned you've been doing it for 20 years. So what was life as a young person? Because again, you're not, 50 years old, you're younger, on the younger spectrum. So you were
Yeah.
an activist from an early age. So what was life like as a younger person?
Yeah. So, when I was in middle school and in high school, I got involved in like the punk scene and the hardcore scene. And those are inherently political things, right? Punk exists because politics exists. Punk exists as like a counterculture to the status quo. And politics have always been a major part of that, right? Politics have always driven responses from those subcultures. During the 80s, there was a big backlash against Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and you saw a lot of punk kind of rise out of that. And so it was the same way for me. At a very early age, I got involved in the punk and hardcore scenes, and in a lot of ways that started because I thought they looked cool, right? Like I thought
Right.
the kids looked cool. I thought the stuff that they were into looked interesting. There were all these bands from all over the world talking about all of these different issues. And one of the things that came up directly for me was like anti-racism and animal rights. Those were two things that I sort of like globbed onto immediately, partly because of the way that I was raised. So it's interesting. My dad is kind of right wing now, but my parents raised me to be very social justice minded, to when I see things that are wrong or seem unjust, to fight against them. My family's Jewish. My mom lost much of her extended older relatives in the Holocaust.
Oh,
And, so I was raised to be very sensitive to that. She said, if you see that, you call it out, you fight it, you don't just submit to it and let it happen. And so that was always kind of my approach. And then I learned about animal rights issues around like meat production and dairy production and how problematic they are, both for the animals and for the environment. And I just really wanted to be a part of that. I felt like it was something that needed to be agitated and educated about. So I started going to like animal rights protests and I became vegan when I was like 13 years old. I stopped being vegan and was vegetarian for a short time when I was about 15, but that's been something that's been consistent in my life ever since. I've been vegan basically since I was 13. I'm 37 now. So
yeah.
a long time, I would say that was my entry point into social justice and to activism. And it's kind of expanded since then, right? It started with animal rights. That was my entry point. But since then, it's addressed issues of like income inequality, economic development on a global scale. I was a PhD student in sociology. I ended up leaving after I got my master's. But the work that I did was on economic development and the impacts on both the environment and on people in least developed and developing countries. And so I've kind of just always had that focus. I've always gravitated towards it. When I was in Southern California as a kid, I used to go to animal rights protests. I'd go to LA and do like anti-fur protests, stuff like that. And then when I moved to Portland, I got really involved in doing like vegan outreach. I started an organization with a friend of mine at the time that was like a mentor program to try to help people go vegan and like give people guidance. You'd get a mentor that would like take you shopping and show you what to buy. And
Oh,
we just
nice.
wanted to try to make veganism easy and accessible for people. And then a lot of the Iraq war stuff around the Bush administration was going on at the time. And so I got really involved in that. And then that sort of like segued into doing work with Occupy when I moved to Hawaii. The whole Occupy thing happened about a year and a half after I got to Hawaii. And I felt like something was happening and I had to be a part of it. It felt like that was our time to really make a difference,
Right.
No,
most definitely. So for those of the uninitiated, how would you describe the Occupy movement? What was it about? What was the main points? What was your role?
Sure. So the main point of the Occupy movement was to point out the vast economic inequality that exists in the United States. There were some, address of like global economic issues and all of that, but it really started out of this idea that there's a very powerful class of people that are in the upper echelons of income earning that kind of dictate a lot of politics in the United States. And the Occupy movement was a way to kind of stand up against that. A lot of people, I hear a lot of people, friends, my own family members, they'll think, oh, I'm a rich person, so I vote for Republicans, right? It makes sense. I want lower taxes. I want all these things. But what they don't realize, when people are talking about taxing the rich, they're talking about taxing billionaires,
Right.
not your dad who's a software engineer that makes $150,000 a year. Like, yeah, that's a substantial income, especially for someone that grew up in like inner city Baltimore or Philadelphia,
Right.
where the average income might be $12,000 a year, $20,000 a year. below and above the poverty line, like barely, right? But that's not what we're talking about, right? Those people aren't the people who have power in the United States. The people who have power in the United States are people with billions of dollars of net worth. People like Charles Koch, who can, create political action committees and like fundraise for political candidates. And there's an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's called ALEC. And they essentially take corporate written legislation. It's a coalition of corporations that kind of funds this group called ALEC, and they write legislation, and then that legislation goes to Congress and gets made into laws, right? So when we're talking about like people who have powerful influence in the United States and kind of like standing up against that and giving like average people a voice, those are the people that we're talking about. And that's not just it's important to point out, that's not just a Democratic problem or Republican problem. That's a US problem, and it affects the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Libertarian Party, you name it. That's how politics is done in the US. And we kind of saw that. Occupy was a point of people saying like, no, we're not going to settle for this anymore. And that's where that like 99% versus 1% came from, right? 1% was sort of like this rough slogan. I wasn't in Occupy Wall Street. I wasn't at the origination of Occupy, but that idea resonated with me, and it resonates with me not because it's like the most accurate way to describe everything, but it's an easy slogan that helps you understand the fundamental power dynamics, even if the details are a little muddy.
Yeah. And a lot of times you need like a catchy slogan or something to just draw people's eyes to get them in before you can actually educate on the topic.
Exactly. And 99% versus 1% is roughly accurate. There's a 1% of income earners in the United States who make a vast majority of wealth more than everyone else. Does it get a little more complicated? Sure. You start looking at the top 10% of the 1%, and they tend to have a lot more than the rest of that 1% does.
Yes, they do.
And so it's definitely more messy in reality, but nonetheless, I think the slogan works, and it's something that people understand. And I think we've seen it kind of manifest into these larger political movements. We've also seen it co-opted by various people who don't want to see, it's co-opted by people who I think have good intentions, but fundamentally want to make positive changes in people's lives, but ones that do not disrupt the status quo, right?
Definitely.
And that's where I feel like the modern Democratic Party is. I think that's what the resistance to like Bernie Sanders' candidacy in the Democratic Party is, what the push towards people like Joe Biden is. I think politics makes people cynical, and it makes people want to preserve what they have. I think Democrats probably care about people a little bit more than Republicans do. Like they care about whether you can pay your bills or pay your rent or whatever, but they don't want to fundamentally disrupt that power dynamic, that status quo, because it benefits them as well, right? If we actually created like a just society, many of those people, almost all the Democrats in Congress are millionaires. Almost everyone in Congress is a millionaire.
Yeah.
So, they don't want to pay higher taxes than they have to either. They don't want to see a fundamental disruption, because we're not just talking about paying higher taxes to create social programs. That's something Democrats want to do. We're talking about like a fundamental disruption to power in US society, creating a more equal playing ground and more equitable playing ground for everybody. And that challenges a lot of people, regardless of whether they have a D next to their name or an R next to their name.
Yeah.
So it goes way beyond like traditional conceptions of politics.
So shifting gears a little bit, Rand, one of the things you mentioned was that, this is a passion that follows you throughout your life. At this point, and you mentioned you have a degree in sociology, but as a teenager, let's take you back to teenage Rand. With the sociology aspect, is that what you wanted to be when you were like, say, 13 to 15?
Not at all. So I didn't think school was for me. So that's the interesting part of my story. So I had trouble in school, and that started as early as middle school. Actually, it probably started before that. I was never great at like following rules. I always had a bit of an anti-authoritarian streak to myself. Yeah. And so like, some teachers loved me. They either loved me or they hated me. I resonated with them or I didn't, because I would ask questions when I wasn't supposed to. I would get up and walk around. I didn't really write inside the lines. I didn't color inside the lines. And so that started early, but it kind of manifested into real problems in middle school, where I started being, once I started getting involved in the punk scene and was like a little skater kid and a surfer and like did all these different things. The last place I wanted to be was school that had all these rules, told me how I needed to act and what I needed to say. And it just felt so constricting, right? And so that really didn't resonate with me. And then when I got to high school, that just amplified even more. And I almost failed out of high school.
Wow.
Yeah. I was too punk for high school. So by junior year, I was 60 credits behind. I think I'd gotten credit for like a handful of classes I'd taken the entire time I was in high school, and was on the verge of dropping out. And the only reason I did graduate from high school, but the only reason I graduated from high school is because my high school had like an independent study program where you could still work towards a diploma from that school, but you could kind of do it on your own terms.
Oh, okay.
And so I would do schoolwork from home, and then I would come see a teacher like once a week to check in or to take exams.
Gotcha.
And that allowed me to kind of live my own life. I wanted to go to punk shows. I wanted to go to protests. I wanted to go surfing, and I could kind of structure my schoolwork around the stuff that I wanted to do. And if I hadn't been able to do that, I'm certain I would not have graduated from high school. And graduating from high school and gaining some of the skills that I did was the only reason I was able to go to back to college when I was like 24 years old and be successful at all whatsoever.
Yeah. What would you say were your biggest skills? You mentioned that if I didn't gain the skills or the degree, what were some of the major skills you took away from your experience back then?
Yeah. So, I mean, I learned to read at a fairly early age. I learned to write fairly well at an early age. Math, I was good at until I got to a certain point, and then I struggled, and I kind of got this like sense of imposter syndrome and failure. And it took a long time for me to realize that I could be good at math, and I was fine, did it in college, and it went totally fine. But in high school, that wasn't the case. But the reading and writing piece was really important. And without it, I could not have done it. I mean, when you enroll in community college, anyone can go to community college. That's one of the amazing things about it.
Right.
But they make you take a placement exam when you're first starting to kind of see which classes to place you in. And I scored like 99th percentile on the reading and writing. And because of that, I was able to start taking college level reading and writing classes immediately. And I don't know what would have happened if I'd had to take a whole bunch of like rudimentary reading and writing classes. I would have had a hard time with math. I basically had to start from scratch. In community college, I started in pre-algebra and just worked my way up through college algebra. I wouldn't have had the time or the money or the energy to do that with all of my classes. And also those other skills kind of build. If you can't read a math textbook well, and you can't take notes well and organize your thoughts well, you're going to have a really hard time being successful in any math class. And so I think those early skills were crucial, and that carried through, even though I hated school, never took it seriously, and ended up being successful in college because of it. I think it would have been a lot harder. It's not to say it would have been impossible, but I think it would have been a lot harder if I didn't have that going for me already.
No, most definitely. But why sociology? I mean, I'm not bashing or anything. I'm just genuinely curious, because you mentioned activism, you mentioned all those things. So I would have thought something more along the lines of maybe like social work or something. But why sociology in particular?
Sure. So my undergraduate theory professor, when I was at the University of Hawaii, of all places, described sociology fundamentally as about the study and critique of power in society.
Wow.
And that resonated with me. And that's sort of what I saw. My first sociology, I went to community college. I think I started in like 2005 at Portland Community College. And this was like peak of the resistance to the Bush administration and the Iraq War. And my first sociology class was all about that. It was all about the Bush administration, about the Iraq War, about the repression of activism, trying to fight against it, misinformation, cherry picking of intelligence. These were all things that we kind of like studied and analyzed in the first sociology class I ever took. And that first sociology class, I had this like aha moment where I felt like I'd finally found something related to school that like resonated with what I'd been feeling for years. And sociology didn't change my politics, but it helped me understand it to a better degree and be able to talk about it in a more informed and like developed way, I think.
Definitely. You see, and the reason I had the wow moment when you described how it was defined to you, because sociology was defined with me. I think I even took it with your spouse back in the day during community college. It was defined just the study of people. Boom, simple, basic. But your definition of sociology kind of just floored me just now. Because now that I think about it and I'm working through it in my head based about what you said, it's like, yeah, you're studying people, but you're also studying what makes people tick. You're also understanding the systems in place in which these people have to live, have to, work in, or not work in at all.
Sure. And regardless, sociology, as you may or may not know, is a huge discipline. Okay. There's sociology studies and touches everything that exists in society. So there's sociology of the economy, there's sociology of the environment, there's sociology of gender, there's sociology of social stratification, you name it. There's sociology about technology. Okay.
Wow.
Fundamentally, fundamentally, at least sociology today is usually still about power. So take something like sociology of gender, right? What do they discuss in sociology of gender? In sociology of gender, they study things like gender norms and gender identity and how those things change and define themselves throughout time and place, right? And fundamentally, it's about like what becomes a norm and what doesn't, and why does this become a norm and this is considered deviant, right? So that's just one example. And fundamentally, that relationship, that dynamic between norm and deviance is about power.
It's funny how a thing like that just kind of takes a toll and plays a role in everyday life without people really noticing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's the same for the economy. One of my favorite videos is from a professor that I had when I was at Portland Community College. I was allowed to take classes at Portland State University at the same time. And I had a professor, his name was Ben Cushing. He does some really cool stuff. He's like a lefty activist and everything. But he has this great video on YouTube where he talks about like what sociology is. He looks at something as simple as like coffee as an example, right? And he talks about how coffee intersects with society in so many different ways, right? It touches on things like norms and deviance, because at the end of the day, coffee is a drug,
Yes.
Right? So within some cultures, consuming coffee is a deviant behavior. And in other cultures, consuming coffee is a norm, right?
Yeah.
It's also a point of social communication. We'll say to each other, hey, do you want to get a cup of coffee? Right? And he defines in the video, he talks about how like fundamentally that's just language for, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation with one another. And then there's also the fact of how coffee is made. And then as part of that, he talks about like people in developing countries or least developed countries who actually like grow the coffee and make the coffee, and how in some ways consuming coffee is consuming somebody else's labor in the global South who's producing that coffee for you. That coffee is manufactured for a multinational corporation who has export and import agreements to get it from there to the United States. Or something like tea that's quintessentially British.
Right.
Why is tea quintessentially British? Tea leaves don't grow in the UK. It's fundamentally British because colonialism is fundamentally British, right? And so something as simple as tea and coffee has all these social interactions, of which most are about power.
This is one of the reasons I wanted to have this sit-down conversation with you, Rand, is that you introduced so many good ideas. But I'll save the blowing smoke up your ass for later on in the podcast.
That sounds good.
So I asked you, what did you want to be as a teenager? And we talked about sociology. But who? If I were to ask 15-year-old Rand, who did you want to be?
I didn't want anything. I wanted to go surfing, and I wanted to see the world become a better place than it was. That was all I wanted. I didn't have some professional identity. There was no career that kind of enticed me. I didn't want any of that. The last thing I wanted was to be like what I saw as like a drone sitting in a cubicle working in an office somewhere, right?
Right.
All I cared about was making a difference and leaving the world a little bit better place than when I found it. and
beautiful.
and also like enjoying my life. And the ocean's beautiful and the mountains are beautiful, and I want to get out into nature and like connect with that. And those two dynamics were like the only things that really mattered to me.
I mentioned that's a beautiful sentiment and how lovely that is. And that's a beautiful segue by my part to ask you, how do you define love?
Wow.
This is my favorite question to ask everyone. Everyone I've asked this question to, and this is a little inside baseball here, but typically they're kind of struck at first because everyone defines this one differently. So how do you define it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think about my relationship with my wife, Robin, right? When I met Robin, like the first time I talked to Robin, the first time I heard her laugh and heard them speak, I felt an instant sort of like connection of energy. And I think fundamentally that's what attraction is. I think that's a part of what love is. And I love Robin because I can't imagine my life without her. And I want to see myself grow old and like build something real, build that fundamental connection. My wife is my best friend. That sounds cheesy. A lot of people say that, but fundamentally it's that she is my partner that I want to build my life with. And I think that that's what love is. Love is like committing yourself to another person and then like meshing your life together and building what that life is with you as a couple. That doesn't mean that you don't have an independent life, that you aren't an independent person. I still have friends. I still like to do things by myself without my wife. But fundamentally, my bigger life picture includes them. And without it, I couldn't do it. I don't know. I That's kind of how I see it. That's kind of how I've always seen it. It's this like fundamental connection that brings joy and sometimes brings heartbreak, and sometimes it's a hard thing to kind of define, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of different things. I think it's all of those things. I think it's building a life together. It's this fundamental connection, this fundamental attraction. And of course, love can't just be about physical attraction because people get old over time, they change. Although I think if you love somebody, they're pretty much always beautiful to you, regardless of, what they look like or how much they've aged or, because what you see is that love you have for them. You don't see anything else.
No, most definitely. So with that being said, you mentioned it so eloquently, and my definition renders a lot of the same. When did you first experience or remember first experience either the idea of love in itself, either with a person, without a person, just the idea?
I think as a child, my first love was probably, this sounds so cliche, but my first love, my first understanding of what love was from my mom. My mom and I were very close. She was very affectionate. And so love is sort of like unconditional, right? And that doesn't mean, that can mean a lot of different things. And that leads people to like keep abusive people in their life. And that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
I'm talking about fundamentally, no matter what, I love my mom and she loves me. And it doesn't matter how mad we are at each other in that given moment. It doesn't matter what happens, what tragedies happen, what mistakes happen. I will love her forever and I'll love her forever and she'll love me forever. And it's unconditional. I never even question it. And I think that's fundamentally what I learned love to be. And that's how I've always brought it in my life. The first time I really knew I loved somebody, I mean, there were lots of times when I was younger dating for the first time that I thought I loved somebody, right?
Absolutely.
And then when you feel like real love for the first time, you realize how ridiculous that like conflating that early attraction or that early interest you have in somebody when you're like 14 years old, 15 years old. That's not love. That's just hormones and attraction. And maybe you like them, maybe you enjoy talking to them. But when you really feel like you fall in love with somebody for the first time, that changes your life. It's like that Huey Lewis and the News song, right? The power of love. It's like a fundamental thing. I don't think humans could exist without it. And you feel it and you know it. And I'd say the first time that happened to me in a romantic relationship was my girlfriend Mia when I was like 18 years old. That was the first time I like, I was with someone before who I really respected and cared about, and I loved them, but I wasn't like, I wasn't head over heels. I'd completely fallen in love with this person. Was it that clear at the time? No, it was muddy and confusing and messy. It was only looking back that I realized it. And I, no matter who I dated, no matter who I met, I had some amazing relationships. That one didn't work out for a lot of reasons. I think I was too young and too immature to know how to be a good partner.
Sure. Most
I was also too caught up in bullshit,
Yeah.
like what my friends expected of me, what my identity was, who people perceive me to be. These are all things that you care about when you're a teenager and in your early 20s, and you try to like maintain them, right? And so like, even though I found true love at that point, I didn't know what to do with it yet. And so we were together for like 3.5 years. The relationship didn't work out. And I had many good relationships after that. I was with people for, years after that, in many cases, sometimes 5.5 years. And yes, I felt like I loved them. I said that I loved them,
Sure.
but I didn't have that same connection with them.
Yeah.
And I didn't have that again until I met my wife.
Yeah, definitely.
And that was an instant feeling.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's that with a lot of folks, it's I'm not necessarily in love with the person. I'm just in love with the idea of being in a relationship or being in this partnership with this person. Not to say you don't hate them or you don't, find them attractive, things like that. It's just you're in love and the fact that you're in this relationship. And sometimes it becomes an identity within itself.
Yeah, and I would say true love and successful love requires letting go of a lot of your personal hangups,
Yeah,
right?
most definitely.
You're not going to be successful if you're not letting yourself go completely within that relationship, right?
Yeah.
You have to be willing to, yes, it's a risk, it's scary, but you have to open yourself up completely to somebody else to have that dynamic.
Yeah.
And in some cases, you may love somebody, but you hold back for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't turn into what it could be. Or maybe you have other things going on in your life. You have to be in the right place at the right time in your life to kind of have that foster. And when I met Robin, that was there, and we just connected, and we've been together for nearly 8 years now, and I love them more than I ever have, and it's never changed.
Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned, Rand, is the ability to be vulnerable. And being vulnerable is super scary. Nobody likes to be vulnerable. Nobody likes to take down the facade that they put on when they walk out the door every day. But it's the ability to be vulnerable with that special someone and trust that they're not going to take that vulnerability and paste it all over the wall.
Yeah, and like, I hate to bring it back to sociology, but fundamentally, being vulnerable challenges fundamental ideas that masculine people and cis men learn about being what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, what it means to like present yourself to the world as a man and stand up as a man. You're supposed to be tough, right? You can't show emotion, you can't do all of these things, and that fundamentally doesn't work. You can't find that true happiness without being vulnerable, and being vulnerable doesn't align with traditional conceptions of masculine gender identity. And so I think a lot of people have trouble with that, and it causes a lot of rifts in relationships and people just not letting go. And so, like I said, sociology touches everything, right? And that's fundamentally about like power too. There's like this power that gets expressed through masculine identity in society and reaps benefits on people, really. If or consequences. So I was never hyper masculine. I did grow up in a place where you learned very early to fight and scrap with people, and I kind of grew a thick skin and became a bit of a tough guy as a way. I felt like I needed to be that person to survive the environment that I found myself in, but I always felt uncomfortable with that identity. And in a lot of ways, I transgressed ideas of like masculine identity. So I was always a very affectionate person. I'm a very affectionate friend. If I have friends that I care about, I touch them and I hug them and I'm physically affectionate with them. And that's just not something that like cis men do,
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's created challenges too. You can find people will be like uncomfortable to be around you, so they won't want to be friends with you, and you'll have a harder time developing like friendships. All of these things. I have childhood friends that I loved them. I love them. They were my best friends growing up, and we barely speak because they feel the need to have this like really problematic sort of like masculine identity where they say really stupid shit, and like we end up in this relationship where they say something problematic, I call it out, we argue about it, and then that just happens constantly. And
Yeah.
so I got to a point where we just stopped spending time together.
Yeah.
It's hard. That's hard. Keeping and building those relationships with those different dynamics can be really, really difficult.
Yeah, and at some point, and there's just not with toxic masculinity in general, just in general with folks from your past, right? At some point, as we evolve, or we try to evolve, and we try to become the truer self, as I like to call it, try to become our truer self, whatever that looks like. There's people in the past that just are okay with being where they are, at least on the surface level that we don't understand. And so it kind of at some point, it's, hey, I loved you and I thank you for your time back then and what you were to me then. But I'm in a different place now. And if you can't evolve with me there, that's okay. And I think a lot of folks need to kind of realize that a little bit instead of holding
Yeah.
on to some preconceived notion.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you can't have a real friendship that's built on constant conflict either, Like I feel like it's my responsibility to try to like educate the people I know and the people I care about and show them a better way of doing things, a more just way of thinking about things. But there's a limit. People don't want it. I understand it. I understand it completely. Who the hell wants to hang out with someone who calls them out on something they say every single day?
Yeah.
Right. Or every hour or whatever it is. Like you're just going to stop seeing that person. And I understand that. I wouldn't want to be in that situation either. It's like you either like develop, you educate yourself and you learn and you develop a more compassionate mindset, or you have this constant conflict. And if you aren't in a place where you can change or grow or whatever, it's just not going to happen. And you have to be willing to create that space.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, nobody wants to be judged or feel like that you're being judged by a friend or another person. Nobody, because judgment leads to shame, which is a whole nother deeper emotion, especially speaking of toxic masculinity.
And that's why we can't address a lot of these political issues either, because I've been on the receiving end of this, so I understand. When you get called out, I like this approach of like calling people in versus calling people out. And it's taken me a long time to kind of develop that. And even then it doesn't always work, right? The idea of calling people in is like not to make a spectacle out of them saying something problematic. It's about like pulling them aside and saying like, look at this, let me educate you about this. Let me show you, how these things are hurtful and who they impact and like why you should think about doing things differently in a way that's like caring or whatever. Call outs don't do that.
No.
Call outs really like put people on the spot. That being said, call ins make people defensive too. I think it's our natural like posture to kind of like react immediately to things.
Well, yeah, because at the end of the day, you're looking at the micro, right? When you're calling somebody out and you're being attacked, or the preconceived notion of an attack, you're looking at the micro. You're looking at this person is judging me. This person is calling me a bad person. No matter what the topic is, politics, relationships, whatever have you, you're looking at the micro instead of taking back and looking at the macro. Now, a lot of people can look at the macro and the bigger picture, right? It's like, no, they're not attacking you personally. They're attacking what you are standing for in this particular topic.
Right. It's attacking that particular idea and like pointing out why it's problematic, but it doesn't feel that way when it's happening.
Yeah,
it feels like an attack on you as a person, that you're not smart enough or you're not educated enough or you're not woke enough or whatever it is. And unfortunately, I think the broader left has sort of shot themselves in the foot too around issues of like cancel culture and call out culture. And there's a time and a place where I think those things are necessary, but I also think that they've done a lot of harm in places where they shouldn't have. And part of that too is that this is so intertwined with ideas about identity. And a lot of identity is like performative, and you want to, you think of yourself as a good ally, so you want to act like a good ally, and being a good ally is like doing these things publicly in a particular way, or participating in this like call out of this person, or calling for a cancel of this person for doing this or that. And I get it. It's complicated. That
Yeah.
that goes to sociology too, but
No,
I won't get into it again.
no, that's perfectly fine, and you're absolutely right. It's what a lot of folks struggle with. I feel like is wanting to be a good ally and virtue signaling, right? Walking that tightrope.
Yeah, it's telling everyone like, I am a good person, right? Yeah. It's I stand for these things. I care about these things. And it's not as simple as saying like, oh, that person's performative or that person's virtue signaling. It's we perform our identities every day. It doesn't mean that you don't genuinely believe those things.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
So, it's not a black and white situation. It's we are human, and we are problematic, and we are social creatures, and part of being social creatures is having that social identity and telling people who you are, and finding other people who tell people similar things about who they are.
Yeah.
And you can't separate those things.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, such a great point. It's one of my personal philosophies. You mentioned it's not black or white, and I like to introduce the topic of and, right? Like, you can stand for some really great things, and you can also be an asshole.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And you can ebb and flow between the two. I have been an asshole plenty of times in my life. Plenty of times in my life, and I've seen judgmental, or maybe even been judgmental plenty of times in my life. And sometimes it's hard not to be, or that's just like your initial reaction to something, and then you think about it for a while, and you realize how problematic that is for a lot of reasons, right? Because fundamentally, regardless of what our identities are, or how we present ourselves, or how we perform, or whatever it is, it should fundamentally be, at the end of the day, about the work, about making a positive difference. And the only thing I care about is, what is the best way to do that, right? Is this productive? Is this counterproductive? Does this make people think? Does this bring people along, or does it push them away? And that's not always a simple question to answer. And I think a lot of the time we act like we know the answer, and we don't. Yeah. Social change is complicated, and there are lessons to learn from history. And I think it's also a mistake to rely too much on history, because looking at history can sometimes define what's possible. And I think the world that's possible is the world that we can imagine. It's just a matter of figuring out how to make it happen.
Ooh, you know what? You're so great at transitions. So speaking of imagining, in your perfect world, how do you imagine it?
Well, so it's complicated, right? Like everything.
Fair? No, totally.
Fundamentally, I'm an anarchist. Like, I identify as an anarchist, and I identify as an anarchist because I am both anti-authoritarian and anti-capitalist. And so anarchism like resonates with me most closely. That's not to say that I don't engage in other types of political discourse. Sometimes I might sound a little bit like I'm channeling a moderate, trying to talk to someone who's conservative and help them, like, try to educate them to understand like why a particular perspective or issue or something is important or problematic or whatever it is. But fundamentally, in my heart of hearts, in my perfect world, I imagine an equitable and just society that's built on community support and the idea of mutual aid, like all of us helping each other out. I think we can create the types of structures that we need, whether that's like, work, the economy, healthcare, whatever. I think we can do that best by organizing ourselves. I think of it fundamentally as like the way that a co-op workplace works, right? Where you don't have a hierarchical organization. Everyone has their roles and their different ideas or whatever. But fundamentally, the organization is horizontal. Everyone's voice, everyone's position, everyone's role is equal. That doesn't mean that everyone is an expert on every topic and should be, their input should be valued on every topic. But it does mean that you don't have a fundamental hierarchy between people, that we are all, at the end of the day, equal. whether that's our workplace or our school or our home life. In my home life, my wife and I try to put that into practice by splitting chores around the house. And sometimes I do dishes, sometimes my wife does dishes, sometimes I cook, sometimes my wife cooks. We don't have split gendered domestic duties. And the reason we don't have that is because we want a household that feels equitable. There's work to be done, we've all got to do it, right? And so, like, fundamentally, that's how I would like to see society structured. And I think it is politically possible. I think one of the things that people forget is that humans have existed for over 100,000 years, right? Within that time frame, industrial capitalism as we know it is a new idea.
Yes.
It's not just because it seems like it's the way that it's always been, doesn't mean that it is. One, that's the first thing. Like, historically throughout history, there have been indigenous societies built on ideas of like bartering goods or gifting goods to each other. Some of those were relatively peaceful. Some of those were filled with relative conflict. Some of them had equitable gender dynamics. Some of them didn't. I don't think it's as simple to say like, oh, if you create this horizontal structure versus a hierarchical one, you're going to solve all your problems. I don't see anarchism as like some utopian panacea that's going to solve the problem. I see it as a step in the right direction. I think once we're equal on things like power and gender and income and identity, then we can start to figure out how we really get along as people. And there's like historical examples of this, but then I don't want to limit myself to the historical examples of this. That's something that, like, there's a strain of thought, and I won't get into it. I don't consider myself like an expert on anarchist theory or anything like that. But there's a strain of anarchism called anarcho-primitivism that wants to like restore sort of like humans as like in like hunter-gatherer societies, or there's various scales of like what that might look like. And so I won't get into all of it, and I can't do it justice, so I won't. But I think that, that idea is based on like humans existed successfully in this one way, sort of like without harming the environment or doing all these things fairly equitably. There were less wars, there was less conflict, there was less inequality. There wasn't no inequality, but there was less inequality. And yes, that's great. But that doesn't mean that we have to, that's the only way that humans can exist. I think relying only on history to teach you lessons about the politically possible is problematic, because just because something always has been doesn't mean it has to be that way. Yes. Right. And I think that's true whether we're looking at like historical examples of how to organize ourselves, or looking at like, okay, this is the world that we exist in. So that means that these are the only things that are politically possible. The only things you should support, the only positions that you should take up politically are positions that can get 51 votes in Congress, right? Definitely. Or get 2/3 votes so that they can't be filibustered. If that's the only way that you see the politically possible, you're never going to make fundamental real change in society. And I think we have historical examples to kind of go by, right? Like the achievements that did happen over civil rights or gay marriage or whatever were by challenging the politically possible and demanding a more just and equitable society. And we've made some progress on those things. We have a long way to go. So I don't want to give the impression that I feel like those are problems that have been solved. They're not. Long before we had the recent issues that we've had since like Trump was in office or Bush was in office, those problems have existed long before that and continue to exist. Nonetheless, the progress that was made was by challenging what was politically possible and by imagining a more equitable and just society and then fighting to get it. And so, it can be very easy. The reason I say this is because it can be very easy to sort of say like, oh, that you want to create this like community-based socialist utopia where people like collect their resources among each other and have collective self-defense and do all these things. That's a pipe dream that could never work. And I'd say it can work if we want it to work, right? If we choose to make it possible. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, humans are social creatures, and we have to interact with each other. I don't have some fundamental like utopian conception of human nature. I don't think humans are evil. I don't think they're fundamentally good either. But at the end of the day, we are fundamentally social, right? And being social requires cooperation. And the idea of anarchism and anarchist organizing is fundamentally about building cooperation and understanding a community with each other, and then collectivizing our resources within that to like solve bigger societal problems.
So what I will ask you though is, what do you personally define as a strength of yours?
Wow. I don't know. It sounds like a job interview question. I don't know. I think I'm good at taking complex ideas and expressing them in ways that resonate with people and that they can understand. I'd say that's probably my best skill. And then, as far as like a human interacting day to day with the world and like doing content creation or doing other things, I've always been like fairly tech savvy. That's another strength that I have. I don't need to know how something works. I can sit down and figure it out.
Okay.
And I think that curiosity has lent itself to like both things I do with technology and things that I do in school or my professional life or whatever.
Yeah, because I was just about to ask, because you're mentioning skills, but the curiosity aspect, I think if you're taking it just to that next degree, right? I think one of the biggest strengths is just your curiosity, right? Curious about topics, curious about things, even though if you don't know them, you will take the time to sit down and figure them out.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I think this is true for everyone. I think we can learn anything we want to with enough time and effort. I don't think, yeah, sure, there might be people who are better prepared for a particular skill or something, so they're better at it. If you're a little bit taller, you're going to have an easier time playing basketball than someone
Right.
who's shorter, right? But anyone who's good at anything spends a lot of time doing it. They put the time in, they put the work in, and I fully believe that anyone can be good at anything if they're willing to invest the time and effort into it. And so that's what I try to do. I don't say like, oh, I can't figure this out, I'm not going to be able to. I make myself figure it out. I spend the time,
Yeah.
and I'm curious. I click, or if it's a technology thing, maybe it's like a new software thing I've never done before, or I'm trying to learn how to code and I've never done that before. I think the best thing you can do is sort of like tap into your younger child self who was curious and wanted to explore it. Just mess around with stuff and see how it works, and once you do that, you start to like understand it. I think the other thing that we can do to understand things better, and that's another skill, is teaching someone something. So I was the type of person, when I was in school, I was the type of person that I would make a study guide for an exam. Okay. And then I would send that study guide to everyone in the class and say, I made this resource. If you want to use it, you're welcome to use it. Okay.
Yeah.
And my partner at the time, she was like a very good student. She went to a much more prestigious college than I did at the time. And she thought that was crazy, that I would like put all this work in and then just like share it with everybody. But like, at the end of the day, I created the study guide. I'm going to know the study guide better than everybody else.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm just sharing that knowledge with everybody else. And if it helps them, great. That's all I want. And it's sort of like we can lift all boats at the same time. But I put the work in, I put the effort in, I created the thing. And to create that, I had to develop an understanding that was greater than just like absorbing or memorizing the material.
Yeah. And honestly, Rand, that's one of the things I admire about you, which is one of the reasons why I want to have you on this podcast, is just how you mentioned, like, I created this thing, but here, let me share this. Because I've noticed in that a lot of myself, and it took a lot of personal growth and it took a lot of work. But one of the things I've noticed, just, no, look, here's a resource I have. Just, can you use it? You don't have to, but here it is. Like, I want to share that with you. It's one of the qualities I admire. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like, I've always gravitated within technology anyway. I've always gravitated towards free and open source software, and I've always been a big advocate of free and open source software. That doesn't mean that everything. I'm not zealot about it. I use Windows sometimes, and I play games that have proprietary software and stuff like that. But like the idea of free and open source software is this idea of like sharing knowledge and then getting everyone's input to make it better. And I think that that's fundamentally like how we make progress. That's how science is done. We have this conception of like science as like one genius in a laboratory doing experiments and coming up with this great discovery, but it doesn't work that way. basically every breakthrough scientific achievement throughout time has been a collaborative effort between people. And the more people you can have invested in that process, the better, whether that's software or scientific research or whatever it is. If the only people working on a particular software package have a Microsoft ID, there are only so many ideas. When you have millions of people from all over the world with different ideas, perceptions, life experience, different like skill sets, you get different perspectives. And I think those different perspectives and those different skills are our strengths, because everyone has spent their time doing different things and gaining different skills. And you get to bring that together collaboratively on like a global scale. I think that's incredible. And there's a lot that can be done there. There's a lot of reasons also why that hasn't happened yet. I think I don't like, especially when it comes to like desktop computing, a Linux desktop has 2% market share. Like no one uses it. I'm like one of the only people, me and like a few million of my friends in a world that has like billions of people, are like using this on a regular basis. But that there's a lot of reasons for that. And that's because there's different competing interests. There's companies that are wealthy. There's also challenges around like masculine identity within the coding world and people who are like involved in technology. And that leaves a lot of different perspectives out of projects, because people who identify as women might not be comfortable in those spaces, or find that it's not a welcoming space for them, or it's a space that doesn't jive with what they expect or whatever. And so there's a lot of voices that haven't been included in that I think could be, but conceptually, I think that's the way that we should be doing things. And so that's what I advocate for. And that's what I try to use most of the time. If someone watches my stream, chances are I'm streaming on Linux, not always. Sometimes a game just doesn't run on Linux and I want to play it. So I play it. Like I said, I'm not a zealot about it. But I think the idea of free and open source, sharing that knowledge with everyone and having everyone, anyone can contribute to an open source project. That's incredible. I think that fundamentally, like that's what we should be striving for. And so that's why I like to support those projects.
No, most definitely. So we mentioned a lot of your strengths, a lot of the ideas of what your strength makes up. But Rand, when's the last time you sat back and admired, like, hey, yeah, I'm pretty good at this? When's the last time you admired one of your strengths?
Gosh, I don't know. It's never that clean, right? So like even when I was in, I don't usually realize I'm good at something until after it's happened.
Right.
So like when I was in my grad program, my PhD program for sociology, I ended up leaving after my master's. But I spent 2 years in this program and I had to develop a substantive research paper as part of my master's degree. And I had imposter syndrome almost the entire time I was in the program. Okay. I had come from the sociology department at the University of Hawaii, which isn't particularly well known. It's not particularly prestigious. There were I had students in my cohort who had gone to like Dartmouth, and these like really prestigious colleges where like all the like smart people go. And I was in my first year classes. I can remember sitting there and there were some like fourth year grad students who were saying stuff that I didn't even understand. I couldn't even comprehend. But I managed to get through the program and I managed to write a pretty darn good research paper. I had probably one of the better master's papers in my cohort at the time. Now, I haven't done anything with it since, so I'm sure people's other papers ended up much better than mine did. But at the time that we presented it for our defense, mine was one of the better ones in my cohort. But I didn't realize that until I'd done the presentation and gotten feedback from everybody. And then I realized, wow, I actually did a pretty good job with that, right? So I would say that I'm pretty bad at realizing I'm good at something while I'm doing it. It's not until I see feedback from other people or I have that aha moment after it's done. When I'm in the mess of it, doing it, it feels chaotic and it feels like I'm finding all these problems, or I don't understand this concept, or, I read this like statistical analysis and I don't know what to do with it. And it's not until after the dust settles that you're like, wow, that actually turned out pretty good, didn't it? Right. And that's a hard thing, realizing that you're good at something in the mess is a hard thing. And I'm not good at doing that.
Okay. So you mentioned being proud of skills or practical use of knowledge, but when's the last time you took back and admired one of your strengths, like a personality trait, like being caring or things like that?
Well, there's not a ton of you don't get a ton of positive feedback for like caring about the world and trying to make it a better
Fair.
place.
That
You
is
get a lot of like negative recriminations from people who don't want to hear it, right?
fair.
But I guess like so doing activism, I think when you see a campaign be successful, that's when you can realize like, hey, I did a pretty good job with that. But it's worth noting that like none of those achievements were done. I didn't do those alone,
Sure. Most
right? Those are collaborative efforts with people that I was organizing with. So I might have done a really good job, but I only did a good job because the people that I was working with enabled me to do so. And so that's kind of how I look at everything.
So on the topic of activism and you talked about your graduate program and what you're doing with your life and all of this fun stuff. What career path or paths would you choose for yourself if the factors of money, education, all of those other bystanders were just moved?
Ooh, that's interesting. I think I'm fascinated by astrophysics.
Ooh,
And yeah, I never had it's not that I couldn't have, but I didn't have the math skill set that I needed to be able to do it successfully in the time that it would have required to do it. Right. So like if I wanted to go to grad school and get a PhD in astrophysics and like study all this interesting stuff, that's something I could do that now, but I have a career now, I have rent to pay. So if I didn't have to do those things, maybe I would do that. I think honestly though, like if I didn't have to worry about money or any of those other things, I think I would spend most of my time just living my life. Okay. I would be what I want for everybody, which is to be free, to do whatever. If I wanted to like go surfing, I would go surfing. If I wanted to learn a skill and like do jujitsu or like learn how to code, I would do that. I would sort of go where my life took me in that moment. I wouldn't worry about like, okay, well, I have to put in X amount of hours at work so that I don't get reprimanded, so that I don't get fired, so that I get a paycheck to pay my rent. I don't know if I would become like this world-renowned expert in X topic if I had all the free time in the world. As interesting as something like astrophysics is to me, that requires a lot of time and effort and expertise. And I think if given the opportunity, I would just want to be free to do whatever I wanted. So I don't know.
I think that was a beautiful thing. So
Thanks.
my second to last question for you.
Sure.
And this is one I started with your wife, Robin, and I'm trying to institute it every time I do this. Sometimes I forget, but I've asked you a shit ton of questions throughout this podcast. And a lot of times, a lot of people feel like they're under the microscope. So to be fair, what is one question you'd like to ask of me?
Sure. So what drives you to get up in the morning every day?
Oh, Jesus, I didn't know you were going to go deep.
Yeah. Hey, you asked me deep questions. It's
that is
fair.
fair. In all fairness, I think if you would have asked me the same question even 6 months ago, I think I might have had a different answer. But I think right now, at this particular moment on this Sunday in 2021, what drives me to get up in the morning is to try to use whatever influence, whatever power, whatever I have to just make today better than yesterday. Not just for myself, but just for maybe it's a phone call I call someone, or a text message I text with someone, or social media DM, or whatever have you. Just trying to make people realize that they have a voice in this world and that today was a better day than yesterday. Now, tomorrow may be fucking garbage, and maybe today is garbage too, but today was different from yesterday, and you have the ability and the power to look within yourself to try to make it a better day, or try to reach out and touch someone's lives to make this world a little bit better of a place. Because call me naive, but I like to think change can happen just with one person at a time.
Oh, it absolutely can. I think that's a great perspective. It's weird being in this COVID time.
Yeah.
I spent so much time at home. I don't really do much. I don't really go anywhere. But I've still had like a really good time. I focus on the small things, right? Like a really funny conversation I had with my wife, or, we're rewatching a show for the 18th time. How do you make that interesting, right? You notice something you never noticed before that was really funny. And you just kind of live in those moments of joy, those moments of sadness. And that's life. That's living, that's the experience of living. And it's not always good, but it's an experience, right? It's something that you go through. And I think sort of like cherishing that, because at the end of the day, those things change who we are.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
And I think embracing that is part of like living. So I think that's great.
And that's one of the things about COVID times you mentioned, that I'm not to say like, hey, I'm glad we had a global pandemic, but one of the things that I appreciate is it's people finding out those moments, right? Like, hey, I may have watched the same show 18 times, but I found this little, thing. Or it's even the advancement of people using technology like Zoom or FaceTime just to try to reconnect, and seeing how that can actually change the world. And unfortunately, we figured it out during this global pandemic, which is garbage. But the fact that we're finding those little avenues.
I think we're also figuring out that a lot more of us could work from home
Yes.
than otherwise realize that we could. And there's advantages and disadvantages to everything. And I certainly miss seeing people. I miss my colleagues. I miss, the jokes and the conversations and the innovations that can happen when you're like in a room with people. But also like, our jobs don't have to be this disruptive thing to our life, right? Like I don't have to commute when it's dark out in the morning and then come home when it's dark out in the evening. I can like live my life and get my work done at the same time. For a lot of us, that's true. For some of us, it's not. And that's a whole different conversation. But, a lot of us could work from home. And when you have kids or you have animals, like I love my dog Isabel, who's laying on the couch back there. And, because I'm working from home, I get to have these little funny, wholesome moments where she does something silly, or I rub her and she like snorts and rolls around, and I get to take her out for a walk, and who knows who I'll meet or have a conversation with or whatever. Those things couldn't happen if I was like stuck in my office all day. So I don't know. I think we realize that we don't necessarily have to structure things the way that we always have. And so I think that's a positive. I'm not sure what will come out of it when this is all over. I imagine I'll mostly be back in my office, doing the 8 to 5 grind like I was before this all started. But hopefully I can find some time to work more from home and embrace my home life with my wife and my animals and all of that. I feel like that's something that we miss out on we spend way too much of our life working. I think a full-time job should be 20 to 24 hours a week.
Well, if you sit there and think about it, we spend, like, let's say you enter the workforce at age 18, 19, 20, right? And then the retirement age, let's be generous and say 60, right? So that's 40 years of your life working anywhere between 20 to 40 hours a week till you can live your best life, or quote unquote your best life, from age 60. And then hopefully you live a nice, generous life till like 80. So you're working like 40 plus years to maybe enjoy maybe 20 if you're lucky.
Yeah. And what's funny about that is like, I have a ton of privilege, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I make an okay living. I live in a comfortable apartment. I'm not houseless, I don't worry about whether I'm going to be able to buy groceries next week. Sometimes I worry about whether I'm going to be able to pay all my credit card bills, but like, even that's a privileged position to be in. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet I have, because sort of in some ways, because of my privilege, because I went to college and got degrees and took out student loans, I will have debt that will live with me for the rest of my life. I don't think I'll ever be able to retire. And I think that's true for a lot of people in my generation and the people who are now coming after us. And I don't know what that looks like, but I am also reminded that there's a lot of people who never could retire because they never got paid enough to do it. Right.
Absolutely.
Even without debt. So, we spend so much of our lives working and then we never get to stop doing it. Yeah. Who are we doing it for? Well, in my case, I'm doing it for the state of Washington, and I'm doing it for a nonprofit educational institution. So it feels a little bit better than if I was like a corporate lawyer for Exxon or something like that. But nonetheless, I still feel like it's too much of my life. You know, I like my job. I enjoy advising I'm an academic advisor, and I enjoy advising students and talking to them. But I don't think that should have to be 2/3 of my life that I'm awake.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think that should be the case for anybody. And we've structured society in such a way that no matter what you do, your job has to become your life, because you can't pay your rent or feed yourself or do anything without it. That's why when you ask me like what I would do if I didn't have to worry about money or whatever, what skills would I have? I think I would just like live. Maybe if I lived in a world where that was the standard, I would be far more curious
Yeah.
and far more interested in investing time and energy and effort into what I could accomplish. But as of right now, I feel like my life is passing me by and I'm not able to embrace all of it. I embrace plenty of it, but I'm not able to live my life to the fullest because I have these constraints that have been placed on me and placed on everybody else at the same time.
Most definitely. And I agree with a lot of what you just mentioned, Rand. But for my last question of the day before I let you go is, why do you think I chose to interview you?
Wow. I don't know, because I don't know what you know about me and what you don't know about me. Like we had some we've chatted on Facebook Messenger. You come to my Twitch streams, which I really appreciate. We've chatted a bit there as well. You seem like a great, like wholesome person. Robin has said nothing but great things to say about you for years now, years before I ever even knew who you were. So, but I don't know, I feel like I have an interesting story. I didn't even get into all of it. I was adopted. It's like a whole thing. But so maybe that's why. Maybe it's the work that I do. Maybe it's that I was funny. It could be anything, because we have never met IRL, and I don't know like what your interaction has been. I know you and Robin chat and you're friends, and you've been friends for a long time, but I don't know what you know about me. So it's hard to know like what could have sparked your curiosity to want to talk to me. I'm excited that you did, though. I think it's a great way for us to get to know each other. And sure, everyone who listens to this podcast, but you seem like a great person. Robin has nothing but great things to say about you. I was just excited to have an opportunity to like have an in-depth one-on-one conversation with you, because I think that's how you really get to know people.
Well, honestly, Rand, a lot of those things you mentioned was a huge part of why I wanted you on here, right? I feel like we can have a great conversation. I wanted to have an in-depth, IRL conversation about just your life, about life in general. You've piqued my interest with my curiosity about certain ideas and ideals that I just want to learn more about. But honestly, at the end of the day, while that was a major part of it, I just wanted to give a platform I try to give a platform to people who I feel like are good people. I try to give a platform to those who can maybe educate a little bit, whether it's myself and maybe by an extension, my viewers or listeners, I should say. But honestly, I think you're a good person. I think that, in my opinion, I don't have to know somebody for years and years and years to have a good judge of character of someone. So I just want you on here, give you a platform, share some interesting ideas, educate me, and maybe by an extension, my listeners. And I just wanted to thank you for just 90 minutes of great conversation and educational conversation. You brought up stuff that I never even possibly considered. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. And it's been great getting to talk to you as well. Like I said, my reason for being excited was just a chance to get to know you. So I appreciate the platform. Certainly I'm streaming now. I want that to be successful. So that's great. But really it's just about getting to know people and having I want more good, wholesome, well-intentioned people in my life. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be knowledgeable about everything. That's obnoxious, frankly. Right. And that's why sometimes I'm sure I can come off that way if I seem like I know too much about something, or I don't know enough about something that I'm commentating on. Right. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, it's about like having better people in my life and wholesome people in my life where I can be myself and act like myself. And that's really the only thing I care about. When I was younger, like I said, there were a lot of, pressures around identity and how you were perceived and acting a certain way and being a certain way. And I don't care about any of that anymore. At the end of the day, I want to be myself and surround myself with people who notice that and appreciate that. And nothing else really matters.
Well, Rand, thank you for your time. With the last few minutes, I just want you to voice whatever things, maybe I missed a couple questions or a topic that you wanted to talk about. So the last few minutes I have this podcast, Rand, please feel free to pontificate of something I may have missed or something you want to go more in depth about.
So one thing I will plug for the end of this is, like, of all the things I care about, I put environmentalism at the forefront. And it's because it impacts and touches on so many different things, right? Having clean water to drink, having clean air to breathe, having a more equitable society where we're not polluting in communities that are poorer than the ones that we live in. You know, the way that we structure the global economy is really unequal, and that relates to the environment and different things like that, and different risk exposures for like environmental catastrophes or hurricanes or whatever. And so I'd say, like, I think if I could pick one issue out of all of them to really focus on, it's climate change. But it's not climate change ignoring everything else. You can't let go of things like racial justice. You can't let go of issues of gender identity and gendered labor, because these things affect climate change as well. Where we manufacture things, how much pollution we put into the air, how much CO2 we put in the air, who's going to be impacted by those things. All those different identities intersect. And so, you know, there's a lot of conversation going on about racial justice right now, a much needed conversation. But I think it's important to also look at the ways that those issues tie in with issues around climate and who that's going to affect and who that's going to impact. And I would say if we need to keep these conversations about racial justice going, but we need to also, the problem is that we're not having conversations about climate change anymore, because we've taken so many steps back in the last decade around issues like racial justice. We've also exposed a lot of things that have always been there that we just didn't talk about. And so I think that's great. But Trump has just been so over the top and so bombastic that we've also like ignored this climate issue that's pressing and is going to impact us for generations. It's going to impact our kids and our kids' kids and, you know, people in least developed countries most directly. And we're doing absolutely nothing about it. So if you're not doing that around climate change right now, you need to be doing that. Don't stop the other work that you're doing. That racial justice conversation, the issue around gender identity, all those conversations are important, but we have to agitate and we have to organize around climate like our life depends on it, because it does. We will not be able to make progress on any of these other things if we do not have a world that we can live in. And so don't stop what you're doing, but make sure you make time to agitate around climate justice with a focus on those intersectional issues. Don't just make it about the environment or about, you know, it's not about like hippies eating granola or whatever it is. It's like a fundamental conversation about intersectional identities and intersectional inequalities that exist fundamentally in society and the way that climate change intersects with those. And so if we can have that intersectional conversation about climate change, I think we can tie in these other important issues of equity and justice in the world as well.
Yeah. The
So,
idea of and.
Exactly. It's not one or the other. We have time to do multiple things. We also need to make time for ourselves. I would say too, the other thing I'll say, like I've done activism for a really long time, and I care about a lot of different issues. I spent time on income inequality. I've spent time on racial justice. I've spent time on environmental issues, animal rights, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, like you have to live your life and you have to get through from day to day and be able to fight another day. And so make time for the people that you care about. Make time for your friends. It can't just be about the work. It has to also be about like living your life and having those experiences, because those are the only things that are going to keep you going and allow you to like fight another day. You know what I mean? And so regardless of what you're working on, whether it's climate change, whether it's animal rights, whether it's environmentalism, whether it's racial justice, whether it's police brutality, it doesn't matter what the issue is. The most important thing you can do is keep fighting. And if you can't keep fighting, you're no good to anybody. So take care of yourself, take care of the people around you, take care of your friends, and recognize how, that if you care about these issues, they intersect in such a multitude of different ways across different issues. So don't become too single issue focused. Even climate change, like I don't just focus on that, and I focus on all those intersections at the same time, because I think those conversations are important and need to happen.
Well put. Plug your Twitch, plug your Twitter, plug whatever you want to plug, so our loyal listeners listening at home could follow you if they want to have deeper conversations or just have a good time on your Twitch, to be honest.
Twitter.com/Knish_of and then _death. If you're interesting, I want to follow you and I want you to follow me. And then my Twitch as well. I stream Mondays and Wednesdays from 7 to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Usually I'm playing a game. That doesn't mean that's all I will do. We often have a conversation. We can engage in anything that chat really wants to address at that day. And so I welcome everybody. And that is twitch.tv/Knish_of_death as well. If you don't know, a Knish is a Jewish potato delicacy. You can get them all over the place, but the only one that, like the OG Knish that exists, is from Jonas Schimmel's on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I can't plug that enough. all of their Knishes that don't have like something explicitly dairy or meat in them are vegan. So like their vegetable Knish is like potato and vegetables, it's vegan. So it's cool there. But that's the OG Knish, and I love them. I talk about them all the time. And I have to plug a friend of mine. My friend Arusha Everblack has an amazing stream that talks about issues of gender identity, of politics, of whatever. And she has built an amazing community of people. And I bring that up because I was talking about how much I love Knish, and Lucia was actually the one who came up with the joke name Knish of Death. And thought that would be a great tagline, and so I just kind of ran with it. And I think it's funny, it becomes a conversation starter everywhere I go, because no one knows how to pronounce it. Like everyone's like, oh, do I pronounce the K? Do I not? Let's put it to rest. It's Knish, and it's a Jewish potato delicacy. And I made basically a joke of a pun name that I use for everything that I do now. So that's who I am. That's because I care about all these things, but don't want to take life too seriously at the same time. Right?
Absolutely. Well said. And in the episode description, folks, if you couldn't catch all of that, it'll be there. I'll make sure to post the Twitch stream post and his Twitter name and all of those fun things. So, Rand, once again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing space with me. And thank you for educating and possibly bringing in new people into the community.
Thanks for having me. And if you ever want to explore one of the topics that I talked about in more depth, we can totally do that.
All right. So thank you, loyal listeners, for taking the time for this hour and a half to just sit with us and listen. I appreciate you. We appreciate you. And hopefully 2021 will treat you better than 2020.
Hello, this is Peter Falk, and you've been listening to the Ludic Lounge cast, brought to you by the Ludic Lounge. And just one more thing, be sure to follow us on Twitter, at the Ludic Lounge, Antonicus at RojoLoco44, and John at just_John_0891. Or feel free to email us at theludiclounge@gmail.com. Thank you very much.